Welcome, and thank you for joining Sno-Isle Libraries for an evening with J.A. Jance. Jance is the New York Times bestselling author of the Ali Reynolds, J.P. Beaumont, Joanna Brady, and Walker family mysteries. And now, here's J.A. Jance.
Good evening and welcome to my dining room, actually. The dining room happens to have the best light of any place in the house. The hostess noticed that when I sat down, I wasn't wearing my favorite Bisbee blue turquoise blazer. In fact, the blazer I'm wearing tonight is actually my Library of Congress blazer. A number of years ago, I was invited to the National Book Festival on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And I was told, was asked if I would do a talk at the beginning, a 5-minute talk, a reading from my latest book at the event. And I was told that I would be introduced by First Lady Laura Bush. So that summer, I went to Nordstrom's with my husband and I saw this blazer. It's red with wonderful black beads on it. And I told my husband, that is the perfect jacket to wear to Washington, D.C. So we bought it. We went to Washington, D.C. and before the banquet where I was supposed to speak, we had a moment with the president and the Librarian of Congress and his wife. And when the Librarian of Congress and his wife walked into the room with the president, she was wearing the exact same blazer. So I was there from Seattle and I went up to her and I said, well, obviously it's too late for either one of us to go home and change. She said, okay, we'll just make it a theme. Little did we know that we were actually seated at the same table. So we pretended that it had been a deliberate action on our part and that wearing the same jacket was a deliberate measure rather than an unfortunate accident. So welcome to my home where I'm wearing my Library of Congress blazer. I'm far more comfortable speaking to roomfuls of people because as a public speaker, I find that I gain a lot of energy and encouragement from what's going on in the room around me. So please send your good thoughts. And if you can send a bit of hearty laughter here and there, I'd appreciate it. Before this event, Marie sent me an email that had questions that participants who were coming had already asked. And so I kind of built the talk tonight around answering some of those questions. So if you've seen my events before, hopefully this will be a somewhat different presentation and you won't be bored to tears. So one of the first questions was, when did you discover your passion for writing? Well, that's kind of a tricky question because I discovered my passion for writing by discovering my passion for reading. That happened in Mrs. Spangler's second grade classroom at Greenway School in Bisbee, Arizona. In Mrs. Spangler's room, over against the window, under the window, were shelves that were full of books. And if you finished your work on time, you could leave your desk and select one of the books from those shelves and bring it back to your desk and read it. And it was among Mrs. Spangler's books that I encountered the books of Frank Baum, the Wizard of Oz books. And not just the one with Dorothy and the Ruby Slippers, but all of the other wonderful Oz books as well. And in reading those books, I wasn't so much taken by the wizard hiding behind the green curtain as I was by the realization that a living, breathing person put those words on the page. And from second grade on, that's what I wanted to be, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the person putting the words on the pages of books. Now, that didn't exactly happen overnight. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona. I was the first person in my family to attend a four-year college. Because I wanted to be a writer, I signed up to be an English major. My junior year, I tried to enroll in the creative writing program, and the professor said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers," and he didn't let me into his class. I got a degree in English education. I earned a teaching certificate. I taught high school English in Tucson for 2 years. And then, because I didn't like teaching English that much, I earned a degree in library science. And I spent 5 years as the K through 12 librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson. In the meantime, I also married a guy who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to me. He got a good grade in the class. He never published anything. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little, but that didn't keep him from telling me in 1968, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." So because I wanted to be married, other than writing poetry under the dark of night when he was passed out cold, I didn't do anything about my own writing until years later, after other than writing poetry, which I'll discuss later, I didn't start writing my first novel until I was a divorced single mother living in Seattle. I had 2 little kids. I had a full-time job selling life insurance. And the only time I could write was in the morning between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. because at 7 a.m., I got the kids up to get them ready for school. And then I got me ready to go spend my day selling life insurance. So my first book was published. The first book I wrote was never published and never will be, by the way. The second book I wrote was the first Beaumont book, Until Proven Guilty. And that was published at the end of June of 1985. Spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about Until Proven Guilty now. And Until Proven Guilty is the book in which J.P. Beaumont meets a woman named Anne Corley, who is a beautiful, very troubled individual who ends up becoming J.P. Beaumont's second wife, briefly and badly. So one of the questions on the paper Marie sent me was from someone who said she had been a fan of my books since 1989 when I came to speak at her high school. Well, I knew immediately which high school she meant. That was Juanita High School in Kirkland, Washington. And so I thought tonight I'd tell you a little bit about how that came about, why I ended up there, and what happened as a result. By the way, you're in my house. I'm a storyteller. I tell stories. My husband, my second husband, the good one, says that, Judy, with you, there's no such thing as a short story. They're all long stories. And that's what this is going to be. So in the fall of 1989, my daughter was working at a theater, a movie theater in Victoria here in Bellevue. And she became friends with a young man who was attending Juanita High. And he told her that at their school, for 20 minutes every morning, the school shut down completely. They turned off the phones, the cooks in the cafeteria stopped working, the janitors stopped working, classes shut down. And for 20 minutes, everybody on campus, gardeners, teachers, custodians, students, everybody was supposed to read for fun, reading for pleasure for 20 minutes. Well, I heard that and I thought, whoa, they're promoting reading to be enjoyed as opposed to reading for work or reading for class or reading for whatever. I thought, that's the kind of writing I do. I need to support this. I sold life insurance for 10 years. I can make a cold call. So I got on the phone, got the number for Juanita High School, called up and asked to speak to the principal. And I told him, my name is Judy Jance. I write murder mysteries under the pen name of J.A. Jance. I've heard about your Reading for Pleasure program, and I'd like to support it. So on my birthday, on my 45th birthday, on the 27th of October, I would like to come to your school and I would like to do an assembly to all 1,600 of your students. And I want to talk to them for about an hour and I'll do it for free. And the principal said, who's this again? I said, well, I'm J.A. Jance and I write murder mysteries. And he said, I'll get back to you. So he did get back to me and he said, you know, we have this really wonderful little auditorium that will hold 400 people at a time. How about if you come and speak to the kids in the auditorium? And I said, no, I can do math. I would like to come and I would like to speak to all of your students at once. I would like to do one assembly. I do not want to do 4 assemblies, and I will do it for free. And he said, let me get back to you. He called me up and he said, well, the bad thing is some of the 27th of October happens to be the day that the guys in the shop have their pumpkin carving contest. And so we don't want to do it on the 27th of October. And I said, well, okay then. We hung up. And a while later, he called me back and he said, you know, it turns out some of those shop teachers are big fans of yours. So I guess we're on and we'll do it in the gym and you can do all 1,600 kids at once. Okay, great. The night before, my daughter came to me and she said, Mom, when you go to Juanita High School tomorrow, would you please wear a long skirt? Okay, I can take direction. So I wore a long skirt with a pair of boots. When I got to Juanita High School, it turned out that one of the shop teachers was a huge fan of mine. And because Ann Corley, the lady in Until Proven Guilty, drives a red Porsche, he had borrowed a red Porsche and he drove me into the gym in this red Porsche, handed me out of it, gave me a bouquet of flowers, and that was my 45th birthday. Now, what you don't know about me, I'm sitting down right now. But if I were standing up, you would soon discover that I'm 6'1". I've been 6 feet tall since I was in 7th grade. I wore very thick glasses. I was smart, which made me no candidate for any kind of homecoming queen. So on my 45th birthday, it was the revenge of the late bloomer. It was wonderful. I had a grand time. So I stood at one end of the gym with a microphone and I spoke to all these 1,600 kids at once. And I talked about Until Proven Guilty and about how I always wanted to be a writer. Well, finally, when the talk was over, they opened it up for questions. And this kid way up in the bleachers stood up and said, "Where did Anne Corley come from?" I wrote Until Proven Guilty in 1983, in 82 and 83. It was published in 1985. And so this is 4 full years after the book was published. J.P. Beaumont, my detective, meets Anne Corley when she comes walking through a cemetery on Queen Anne Hill wearing this amazing red dress. And he is completely smitten. But what he doesn't know, and we'll eventually find out, spoiler alert here, is that Anne Corley has a mission in life. And her mission in life is targeting child molesters who have gotten away with it. So this kid asked the question a good 5, 6 years after I wrote that book, and standing there in that room in front of 1,600 people, a light came on and I understood the answer. When I was 7 years old, we went to South Dakota from Arizona to visit our relatives during the summer, for summer vacation. And while we were there, my grandfather, who was a pedophile, molested me. I didn't tell. I thought it was my fault. I thought if it was my word against the pillar of the Lutheran Church in Marvin, South Dakota, who was going to believe me? So I never told. Well, it turns out pedophiles don't have just one victim. And it turns out there were 4 girls in my family. And it turns out he molested all of us. All of us. And none of us told. Well, decades passed. We eventually told each other, but we didn't tell anybody else. And we certainly didn't tell our parents. Then my grandfather died. I was teaching on the reservation and my dad came out to the house to visit us. And he always wiped his forehead when he was thinking deep thoughts. And he said, "I just don't understand why none of my daughters came to South Dakota for my father's funeral." I was 29 years old and I thought, maybe somebody should tell him. And so I did. I told him what had happened to me and to my 3 sisters as well. And when I finished, my father got up. He stalked across the room. He stopped in front of the window and he stared out at Kid Peak for a very long time. And then he spun around and he said, "If I'd have known that, I'd have taken my shotgun and I'd have killed the son of a bitch." It's the only time in my whole life that I ever heard my father say a curse word aloud. And what happened in that moment was astonishing because he gave me the gift of instant relief, instant belief, which caused me instant relief. I think the children who are abused, who are most damaged by it, are the ones who tell and are not believed. And so that really helped me put that event behind me. But it turns out that that event stays with me. And in that auditorium, I suddenly realized that Anne Corley was me. She was doing what I had always wanted to do and going out and taking vengeance for all those abused children. So I told the story I just told you in a room full of teenagers, 1,600 teenagers, for the very first time in public. And when the event was over and I was signing books out in the lobby, this young woman who was probably a freshman from the size of her came up to the table and said, "The same thing happened to me. What should I do?" I said, "There's a counselor. Go talk to her." So I think one of the reasons I tell this story is I know that so many of the kids who run afoul of the justice system have a history of sexual molestation or child abuse in their backgrounds. They often had vision problems that went uncorrected, which made it impossible for them to see blackboards. And so I try to talk about this and say, yes, those things happen to you, but it is not a reason for you to decide you should be a failure. So for that person in the audience who has been a fan of mine since she came to that not accidental assembly at Juanita High School all those years ago. Thank you for being a fan, and thank you for being a reader of mine for all this time. Now, one of the other questions was, have I ever thought about writing a prequel to J.P. Beaumont? Well, actually, it turns out I did. A number of years ago at Thanksgiving dinner, my stepson, Tom, turned to me and he said, "You know, Mom, Beau is getting to be pretty long of tooth. Have you ever thought of writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel?" And I looked at him, gave him this sort of glacial stare, and I said, "No, Tom, I've never thought about writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel." But suddenly it was August. It was time to write the next Beaumont book. And the only idea I had was to write a J.P. Beaumont prequel. So I sat in my chair in the family room with my computer with its blank screen on my lap, trying to figure out what I would put in a J.P. Beaumont prequel. And I was thinking about Beau. I grew up in a family of 7 kids. I have 5 children, 6 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, and those are a lot of birthdays to remember. Then if you add in the characters from 4 different series, that's a lot of birthdays and ages to remember. So with Beaumont, I cheated. I gave him my birthday. That way, I figured I'd be able to remember it. Not only, as long as I can remember how old I am, I can remember how old he is. So I was sitting there thinking about how old Beau was. And then I remembered something from my days at Bisbee High School. 1961, a boy named Doug Davis was the valedictorian of the senior class. He was a year ahead of me. Doug was smart, he was handsome, he was kind, he was a top drawer athlete. He was just a terrific guy. I had a mad crush on him, but I don't think he even knew I existed. He graduated from high school as the valedictorian of the class. He went from Bisbee High to West Point. He went from West Point to Ranger School. He went from Ranger School to Vietnam, where on the 2nd of August of 1966, he died in the Pleiku Highlands. I was unable to attend his funeral. For one thing, I didn't hear about it until after it had already happened. So I always felt guilty that I hadn't been at St. Patrick's Church to honor his passing. So the Beaumont book started coming out, and unbeknownst to me, there was a woman living in Florida at the time, but someone who had grown up in the Seattle area. And in 1966, she was a flight attendant for TWA, I believe. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's TWA. At any rate, her name was Bonnie Abney, and she and Doug Davis met, fell in love. They were engaged to be married at the time he died. The first time Bonnie came to Bisbee was for Doug's funeral. Bonnie was living in Florida. Her family was living here. And so she came back and forth by plane, and she started reading the Beaumont books. And so a Beaumont book was pretty good for a plane ride from here back to Florida. So one day she stopped at the bookstore. She bought the new J.A. Jance book, which happened to be Desert Heat. So she opened it up, expecting to be in J.P. Beaumont's Seattle. And instead, she found herself in Joanna Brady's Bisbee, Arizona. So she called her sister and she said, I don't know who J.A. Jance is. By the way, my name is Judith Ann. But in 1983, when marketing was getting ready to publish, when the Avon Books marketing folks were getting ready to publish Until Proven Guilty, they said, look, male readers aren't going to accept a police procedural written by somebody named Judy. We want to use her initials. So that's where the pen name J.A. Jance came from. So for the first 9 books, there was no author bio, there was no cover photo, and the rumor grew up that J.A. Jance was the pseudonym for a retired Seattle homicide detective. I always thought that once they started putting my picture on the books, that rumor would go away. It has not. They still say that J.A. Jance, they say that a retired Seattle homicide cop writes these books and I'm just a front for him. But I don't care. As long as somebody's reading the books and buying them, that doesn't matter to me. But this was at a time when there were no cover photos. So Bonnie called her sister and said, okay, J.A. Jance must have gone to school in Bisbee, Arizona, must have grown up in Bisbee, Arizona, and he must have known Doug. A few weeks later, I was doing a signing for the second Joanna Brady book, Tombstone Courage, and a lady came up to the table and she said, have you ever been to Bisbee, Arizona? I said, I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona. She said, well, did you ever know somebody named Doug Davis? And I said, of course, I knew Doug Davis. And that was pretty much the end of the signing. I talked to her for a very long time. And eventually she went home. She called Bonnie. Bonnie was living down in California by then. And she said, I went to the signing. J.A. Jance did know Doug, and she'll be calling you in the morning. So the next morning I called Bonnie and we spoke on the phone for 90 minutes. And we've been friends ever since. So I was sitting there in my chair in that August day, thinking about J.P. Beaumont and realizing that he, like me, was only a year younger than Doug. And I thought, what would happen if he went to Vietnam and encountered Doug Davis? So I called Bonnie up and I asked her, what would you think if I took Doug's story and wove it into the background of a J.P. Beaumont book? And she said, let me think about it. At that point, Doug's mother was dead, his brother was gone, and Bonnie was really the only one left to ask. And so eventually, a couple days later, she said, I think maybe you could make it work. And so I started writing the book. And in a book called Second Watch, J.P. Beaumont goes in for bilateral knee replacement surgery, which, by the way, I've had people write to me and say, you just make Beaumont walk in and get his surgery and get right back up and come out. Well, I'm sorry. That was my experience with my husband, who had bilateral knee replacement surgery. And 6 weeks later, he was driving Miss Daisy on a book tour. This one woman just took me apart for setting up this completely unrealistic view of how knee replacement surgery works. But that was how it worked at our house. However, while Bill was in surgery, he was in the hospital after his surgery, he was very happy-go-lucky. He was just having a fine time because he was higher than a kite on drugs. And so he told me that he had very vivid dreams. He was just as chipper as he could be. And so when J.P. Beaumont goes to the hospital to have his knee replacement surgery, while he's under the influence of post-op medications, he's lying in his room and he sees this guy wearing army fatigues, standing, looking out the window at the Space Needle. Now, the problem is the part of the hospital where he was looking out the window faced in the wrong direction. So both should have figured right off that there was something wrong with this situation. Then the guy comes walking over to Beau's bed, and Beau recognizes him as his commanding officer, Lenny D. from Vietnam. And Doug walks up to him and says, "You got old." And Beau says, "And you didn't." And that is sort of the background of that whole story, because Beau came home from the war and Lenny D never did come home from the war. Beau never reached out to Doug's family or to Bonnie to say how sorry he was. And he has carried that burden around with him all this time. Someone said, which is my favorite book of all the books I've written? Second Watch is probably the top. I'm not going to tell you any more about it. If you haven't read it, get with the program and read it because it will touch you. And when you finish reading the book, do not neglect to read the essay at the end called The Story Behind Second Watch, because in it you'll find the miracles that Bonnie, Abney, and I discovered as I was writing that book and she was taking that journey with me. I believe Bonnie is tuned in today. Hello, Bonnie. If you're there, I hope you don't mind my telling this story. So yes, I have written a Beaumont prequel, and whoever asked that question just obviously hadn't read it yet. Somebody says, has the pandemic given me any ideas for writing books? The pandemic has given me a lot of ideas for jumping off a cliff. The pandemic is not good for me for as part of the creative process. It's been very challenging to write a book. I am now, as of tonight, 58.55% done with the next Ali Reynolds book. And you may think my knowing 58.55 is a weird thing to know, but here's the thing about writing books. When I was in the life insurance business, we would have campaigns, and Gilbert F. Lawson, the agency manager, would stand up in agency meetings and say, know the score, keep the score, report the score will improve. Well, that was fine for selling life insurance. But if you're writing a book is a very solitary process. And the only way to keep score is to know how you're doing. And the only way to know how you're doing is to count the words and figure out if you're getting there. So in the past, I started writing in the middle of March of 1982. So my past 3+ decades of writing books has taught me that the first 20% of writing a book is the hardest part to write. The middle 60%, the middle 40%, from 20% to 60, is sort of like slogging through mud or deep sand. Then when you hit the magic 60%, you're on what I call the banana peel. And by then, I know where the story is going. I know where it'll end up, sort of where the crashing climax will occur. And that's when the book gets easy. And my kids were young when I started writing books. And following my life insurance training, when I finished writing a book, we'd do an end of campaign celebration and we'd go out to dinner. So the kids started asking me, well, how are you doing on writing the book? When can we go out to dinner? And I told them, well, I'm not on the banana peel yet, or I am on the banana peel. And they sort of took that at face value, I guess. And it was they probably thought I was speaking a foreign language. My daughter was a senior at Newport High School. And one day there was a huge food fight in the cafeteria. And she came home and she said, Mom, you'll never guess what happened. There was a food fight and there was a banana lying on the tile in the hallway and somebody stepped on it. And now I know what you mean when you say you're on the banana peel of a book. The other day, someone sent me, one of my brother sent me a picture of a vehicle he saw at Walmart in Phoenix. It was a black Jeep. And on the back of it was a big black sign that said, I'm the black Jeep of the family. Well, I thought that was hilariously wonderful. And so the other day, I was driving my grandson, he's 15, I was driving him someplace, and I told him about the black Jeep of the family, but he had never heard the term black sheep of the family. So like with my daughter with the banana peel, I had to explain to my grandson Colt exactly what a black sheep is. And so now that's all better. But I think a lot of times what parents assume that their children have some vague idea of what they're talking about, when in actual fact, it's a foreign language. That's part of the generation gap. You're probably wondering if I'm ever going to talk about credible threat. So I'll talk about credible threat. And if I don't, you'll probably want your money back for this event from the Sno-Isle library. I don't outline my books. I don't outline my series. When I start a book, I usually start with somebody dead and I spend the rest of the time figuring out either who did it, or if I know who did it, figuring out whether or not the bad guy is going to get caught. I was writing the second book, the second Beaumont book, Injustice for All, when I was 70% done with the book, when I found out the guy I thought was the killer didn't do it. And somebody said, well, didn't you have to go back and change the clues. I said, no, he was innocent the whole time. So trust me, I do not outline books. I met outlining in Mrs. Watkins' 6th grade geography class. I hated it then. Nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind about outlining. So if I don't outline my books, you can bet I don't outline my series either. Unlike J.K. Rowling, I didn't start out knowing exactly what was going to happen in the whole series when I started writing Beaumont because, for example, I didn't know that I was writing a series. That was a surprise to me too. So in writing a series, there's sort of a stable of characters that are in the books collectively. And then there are people who walk into the books, and my assumption is most of those people will walk in and they'll walk right on out and I won't have to deal with them anymore. But some characters don't get the memo and they don't necessarily go away on cue. A prime example of that would be Joanna Brady's second husband, Butch Dixon. He turned up in book number 3. He was running the Roundhouse Bar and Grill up in Peoria, Arizona, near where she was attending the police academy. And it was a place everybody went to eat. And I figured Butch was just a one-time guy. But it turns out he wasn't. He kept coming back, book after book. And eventually I figured out that he wasn't leaving. And so he turned out to be Joanna's second husband and the father of 2 of her 3 kids. Now, if I had had any idea how important Butch Dixon was going to be in the whole arc of the books, I would have given him a better name because Butch is a totally dumb name for a grown-up man who has very little hair. So Butch Dixon is kind of an accidental recurring character. And it turns out that Archbishop Francis Gillespie in the Ali Reynolds books is another accidental character. He turned up when when one of his nuns, a sister of Providence named Sister Anselm Becker, turned up in an Ali book called Trial by Fire. Sister Anselm functions as a patient advocate, and that mission is sponsored and directed by the Archbishop Gillespie himself. So I think that was, I'm not sure if that was book 4 or book 5 of the Ali books, when Sister Anselm turned up. She wouldn't go away either, bringing the Archbishop along for the ride. I did not expect that over the course of these books, Archbishop Gillespie and B. Simpson, Ali's 3rd husband, by the way, I didn't know that Archbishop Gillespie and B would become good friends either. This is all a surprise to me. So the Archbishop has sort of been in the background of those books, but I've never really known much about him. I knew he was from the Midwest and I thought he was sort of a stand-up guy, but I had to write credible threat to find out what really makes Archbishop Gillespie tick, because if I drop a character into the books, the only way for me to learn more about those characters, that character, is to write a book about them. Incredible threat. You see, my history, my personal history at work, because what's in the background of that book? In this case, it's predatory priests who, under the guise of being teachers at an upscale a Catholic private high school, have actually been systematically abusing the students left in their care. One of them committed suicide with a drug overdose after having his life totally derailed by what happened to him in high school. So the first person we meet, incredible threat, is his mother. It's years after the death of her son, and that death derailed her whole life, her whole existence. Her husband, the father of the boy who committed suicide, is just loses his way. He loses his job, he loses his pension, and he's hiding out in their garage building birdhouses. Rachel, because they are really strapped for money, has lost her whole social milieu. The child who's gone was her only child. He was the focus of her life, the most important thing in her life. And these people's lives have just been upended. At the beginning of Credible Threat, she finds out for the first time that her son was the victim of one of those predatory priests. And she is seized by absolute rage, and she decides that she's going to get even. She figures the Catholic Church is at fault, and the Pope is a little out of her reach. But Archbishop Gillespie is right there in Phoenix, and she targets him. So here I am taking this sort of ordinary looking, acting 70-year-old woman and turning her into a stone cold killer. And that's part of it in the background of A Credible Threat. You see her systematically changing herself as she is caught up in this need for vengeance. And Archbishop Gillespie, who finds out he's being threatened by threatening notes dropped into offering plates all over his diocese, goes to the cops and they say, oh, you're a public person. And this kind of stuff is just trolling. Or people who do that, they're not really credible threats. And so there's really nothing you can do about it. But there is something he can do about it. He goes to Ali Reynolds and B. Simpson at High Noon Enterprises and says, I think someone's trying to kill me, and I want you to stop them, because if whoever's threatening me succeeds in killing me, that person is going to hell. And I have spent my whole life trying to save people's souls. And so I want you to prevent my being murdered, not because I'm afraid of dying, but because I don't want that person to lose his soul. That is where Credible Threat is. I'm right now writing a book called Unfinished Business. It's the Ali Reynolds book that follows Credible Threat. And they're two people, sort of opposite ends of a teeter-totter. One guy who's been in prison for a murder he didn't commit, and another guy who has gotten away with murder for decades. And those two people converge at Ali's office, High Noon Enterprises in Cottonwood, Arizona. And I have a sneak, but I can tell this to the 584 people who are here right now. It's a secret. I think there's a good chance that J.P. Beaumont will make a cameo appearance in this Ali book. I don't know how much on-screen time he'll have, but I'm pretty sure he's going to play a very important part. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned my poetry, and the only way to tell this story is to tell a little more of my history. I met my first husband the day before my 18th birthday. And he actually lost money on me. He lost a bet because he bet his friend a pitcher of beer that when they came to pick me up, the friend was from Bisbee and he was giving me a ride home. And he bet his friend, Mickey Nemi, that if that a pitcher of beer that I wouldn't be ready to go when they came to the dorm to pick me up. And I was ready, so he lost money on me the first rattle out of the box. I was a straight arrow girl, and he was not a straight arrow boy. We dated for 5 years before we married. I knew he was a drinker. When I brought him home to meet my parents said, you know, this guy is a raging alcoholic. And I said, oh, you're just teetotalers, what do you know? And then I spent the next 18 years of my life trying to prove that they were wrong, but they were not wrong. While we were dating, and for the first 5 years after we married, he told me that when we had kids, he would stop drinking. And I believed him. When we married in 1968, that's when he told me that there was only going to be one writer in our family. And so we lived in a place called The Hill. It was 30 miles from town in either direction. It was 2 miles off the highway. It was 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. And in the evenings, he'd be passed out cold by 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. And I was there by myself. So on those long evenings, with no one to keep me company, I would sit at the dining room table and I would jot off poetry. And at the time I was writing the poetry, I thought I was being true to my art. I knew I wasn't being true to him because I wasn't supposed to be a writer. So he never saw the poetry. I wrote them and wrote the poems, and each night when I finished, I would put them in the strongbox because I knew that was a place where he would never look. In 1972, when it was time to have my first child, he drove me into town. He dropped me off at the hospital. I had the baby. 3 days later, he came back to pick me up, and he was drunk. And there I was. I had this choice. Did I have him drive the car and me hold the baby? Or did I have him hold the baby and me drive the car? And that's how we got home. I drove myself home 35 miles from University Hospital to our home west of 3 Points. But I was pretty hot by the time we got home. I said, look, you promised me all these years that when we had kids, you'd stop drinking. Well, the kid is here, it's time. He said, oh, okay. So when we got to the house, he went into the kitchen, he opened all his booze bottles, and he dumped the booze down the sink. And I thought, well, okay, he's keeping his promise. But what I didn't understand was that the whole time I had been in the hospital, he had been on a terrible bender. And what I really didn't understand was how dangerous it could be for someone like that to go off booze absolutely cold turkey. So for the next 5 days, with no neighbors and no telephone available, I was there at home with a husband who was going through DTs and with a newborn baby. We couldn't turn off the lights because the bugs crawled on him. He sat at the dining room table and played chess with people I couldn't see. He insisted there were FBI agents down at the water hole at the bottom of the hill listening in on our conversations. And I kept saying, okay, I can be strong. I can do this because he's keeping his promise. 3 weeks later, some of his drinking buddies turned up. They popped the lid off a can of Coors, handed it to him, and we were off and running again. That was in 1973. Between 1973 and the spring of 1980, he was hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. And it was always because I was in crisis. His drinking didn't bother him. His drinking only bothered me. In 1980, we were in Phoenix, and he showed up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. And it was during that walk with my kids' friends, and my kids' friends' parents, when I finally realized that if 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I had to do something to save my children and save myself. So I got a divorce. But I was still in Phoenix, and he was still in Phoenix. I got a divorce not because I stopped loving him, but because I needed to survive. I knew that I was still susceptible to him, and that if I stayed in Phoenix and he asked me to take him back, I would. So I did the only feasible thing. I got the hell out of Dodge. We loaded our worldly possessions into a U-Haul trailer, and with my kids in the back seat of my 78 Cutlass Supreme Brome, which my first husband said I never should have bought and would never be able to pay for, we drove from Phoenix to Seattle to start my new life. Now that I'm 70 plus, I can see what a brave thing that was to do, to separate myself from all that was familiar. I came to Seattle. I had a sister living here, and we lived as roommates for a number of years. But it was once I got to Seattle that I was finally able to give myself permission to do what I had always wanted, live my passion, and become a writer. So I divorced him in 1980. In May of 1982, I was living in Seattle. I had started writing. I hadn't published anything yet. He was living in Tempe. He was working construction. He was living in a house that had once belonged to his grandmother, but his mother owned it. He didn't have to pay rent. He didn't have to pay utilities. In May, he broke his wrist in a construction accident. It was an on-the-job injury, so it was covered by workman's comp. And so he was home. He was off work. He had money coming in. He had no bills, so he drank. He drank from May to November. Just before Thanksgiving, his mother, Mary Grandma, called him up and said, I just scored a last-minute ticket to come to Phoenix, so I'm going to fly down from Vegas so we can have Thanksgiving dinner together. And that's what she did. And in honor of her visit, without any thought to how long he'd been drinking or how much, he decided to go off booze cold turkey in honor of her visit. They had Thanksgiving dinner together. At midnight that night, a Tempe police officer saw him lying in the street and assumed he was the victim of a hit and run. But when they got him to the hospital, they discovered that he had actually gone into DTs. He was hospitalized with no liver or kidney function. So he was in the hospital. His mother was in Tempe at the hospital. Mary Grandma only had a 7th grade education. So she was there with her son, but the doctors were just running roughshod over her and they wouldn't give her any kind of straight answers. And so she finally called me up here in Seattle and asked me if I would please speak to the doctors and try to figure out what was going on. And so I did. And this is what happens. It's called death sentence. He's dying. Words come through the wire and hammer home, despite the doctor's cloying, unctuous tone. He's dying. I thought my tears exhausted years ago, and yet it hurts. Oh God, how much it hurts. He's dying. This is what I wanted when I thought a widow's garb would suit me better than a court's decree. He's dying. Should I go to him or stay away? What right have I to be there now? He's dying. I'll go. And I did go. I flew down to Phoenix on Christmas Day. I was there at the hospital with him and with Mary Grandma for the next several days. On New Year's Eve, I took Mary Grandma out for the blue light special. We ate dinner at 5 o'clock. We were back at the hospital by 7. And this is what happened. It's called vigil. We keep a vigil by his midnight bed. His mother and his former wife grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. He's quiet now. A nurse comes in to loosen his restraints, not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. The hours creep by. All stories are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the night at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from bawdy barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. We hold his hands. I sing a line and wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen. I have been writing poetry for years. And poem after poem, I put them in the strongbox. Then in March of 1982, 83, I had to get out all of the documents that you must present when somebody dies. And in with the birth certificates and the marriage certificates and the divorce decree, here were all of these pieces of poetry. And as I read through them, I realized I hadn't been being true to my art. I was being a writer and using words to deal with the central issues of my life. I showed the poems to someone else, and they said, these need to be a book. And they are a book. It's called After the Fire. It's still in print. It's still available. This is an early edition. It's not nearly as pretty as the current edition. The current edition has a wonderful lavender cover, and it shows burned out trees in a bed of fireweed, because fireweed only grows after a fire. In the title poem here, it goes like this. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. Whoa. While I was reading that poem, I realized that I owe you one more bit of coming attractions. I told you that I'm writing Unfinished Business. Because of the pandemic, the pub date for Credible Threat got moved back. And because the pub date for Credible Threat got moved back, then the pub date for the next Joanna Brady book got pushed back too. So the next Joanna Brady book is called Missing and Endangered. It's due out in February of next year. And with any kind of luck, I'll be seeing at least some of you in person, without masks for some. Please, without masks. I can't hear anything when people are mumbling behind masks because actually I need to read lips part of the time. But let's hope we can all go to the Tucson Festival of Books and enjoy some time, some literary time in the sun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Judy. We are so happy to have spent an hour and a little bit extra with you. It's always a joy to host you. We are recording this, so you can look forward to finding this on our website later. Have a good evening.
And your website is, can you give this website, because people may want to know how to tell other people where to get it.
Sure. The web address is www.sno-isle.org. That's sno-isle.org. And we look forward to seeing you on our website.
And by the way, if you would like to send me a personal message, if you would like to tell me, please don't tell about the black Jeep of the family in person. You can send me a note at jajance@me.com.
And all of that information is in chat, and I'll be sending that out in an email as well, along with some other information.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Good evening.